Fantastic. Before I introduce the next panel, I wanted to wish everyone, thanks to my friend Artie, who reminded me that today is Persian New Year. So whoever celebrates, and even to those who don't, Happy Nowruz. Thank you, Artie, for telling me that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm very excited for our next panel of climate leaders. Our top California climate leaders will discuss key policy issues facing the state, including defending climate budget priorities, the potential for a climate bond, appropriate uses of hydrogen, protecting citizens from extreme heat, and how to use electric vehicles to make the grid more reliable and resilient. We'll follow that by a Q&A, so again, please use the cards on your table to write out any questions you might have, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So I'm truly delighted to welcome to the stage Liane Randolph, Chair of the California Resources Board, Senator Scott Wiener, our climate champion from San Francisco, and Assemblymember Isaac Bryan, our climate champion in the Assembly. Come on up. And we're really thrilled to have all of you here. And our climate leaders panel moderator, Deborah Kahn. Come on up, Deborah. Some of you may have seen that Lauren was here, but as she just told us, there's one person who, if she gets a call from, she has to go. And who was the call from? The governor. So she had to leave, but she sends her best. And Chair Randolph will, I'm sure, very wonderfully represent the administration, so thank you. And just briefly, I want to introduce Deborah. Deborah is the California policy editor at Politico. She previously served as Deputy Sustainability Editor, California Bureau Chief, and California Environment and Transportation Reporter, where she covered all kinds of issues that we're addressing today. She came to Politico in 2019 after 13 years at E&E News. Please give Deborah and the whole panel a warm welcome, and I'll hand it off to you, Deborah.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellie. Good morning, everyone. Happy spring. Happy beginning of allergy season. I'm Deborah Kahn, California Policy Editor at Politico, and I am thrilled to introduce this panel. This panel is top-notch, even without Lauren. We'll try to find her and figure out what she's talking to the governor about, so stay tuned. Read tonight's edition of California Climate, which is free to sign up to if you want to find out. But without Lauren, these are just absolute luminaries here. We're going to discuss as many of the big issues of the day as we can get to in the next 45 minutes. Starting with how we're actually doing in terms of meeting California's climate targets. Spoiler, not great. Tough choices with affordability bearing down and a budget deficit, and uncertain headwinds for bond spending in November. And then everyone's favorite topic, SB 253. Or the eternal question of how aggressively California can or should lead the rest of the country and the world. So these panelists need very little in the way of introduction, but I will just say who they are, and then we'll get right into it. And we'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes for audience questions, so there should be index cards at your seats, and people will be coming around to collect those. So we have Assemblymember Isaac Bryan, who's chair of the Assembly Natural Resources Committee, first-term Assemblymember representing West and South LA. And then we have, yes. Then we have Senator Scott Wiener of San Francisco, newly installed Senate Budget Committee Chair. And then we have California Air Resources Board Chair Liane Randolph. So let's just start with the news. As Ellie said earlier today, the group Next 10, which keeps track of California's emissions and progress on climate, said last week that the state is not on track to meet its goals. They found that emissions have been dropping an average of 1.5% a year since 2010, but that the rate will have to nearly triple to meet the legally mandated target of 40% below 1990 emissions levels by 2030, and that at the current pace, California is not going to meet that goal until 2047. So I'm interested in everyone's responses to that, particularly Liane, though, since that's her main job. Why don't we start with Liane and then the lawmakers, and what are the implications of that for everything?
Okay, I guess I would say a few things. We absolutely have to keep pushing hard, and keep making progress. And we have been very clear about that. We have been very clear that we need to make several of our climate programs more stringent. We have been very clear that we need to deploy renewable energy at a scale that is utterly unprecedented. And we know we need to deploy vehicles. We know we need to make progress on building decarbonization. And so, to me, it's really about what are we doing? What are we doing to move forward? What are we doing to make progress? And 40% below 1990 levels is achievable. If we keep doing what we're doing and move faster, we can absolutely do it. I think it's really important to emphasize the progress and the potential for progress, because people need to feel invested and they need to believe that we can do this so that they are willing to make the changes that have to happen, right? I mean, if you spend too much time in a defensive talk, like, oh my God, like this is so hard, like we can absolutely do this. We just need to keep going and try to focus on what we all agree on and what we can move fastest on. And to me, like renewable energy deployment, zero emission vehicle deployment, like those are things that we can continue to make progress on, continue to move faster on. And then we also need to think about the things we don't agree on, but that can still potentially achieve reductions. What are the things that are possible to do and need to be done right? Things like hydrogen or things like CCS. If those can move the needle in doing it the right way, then we need to try. So that's my perspective on the question of targets and how we're doing.
Thanks. One follow-up for you there. I mean, is this the kind of thing that, when the governor calls you, is he like, Liane, we're not meeting our targets, what are we going to do? Or is he more like, oh, we're worried about affordability? Like, are you getting a message from him one way or the other?
It's both, unfortunately. I mean, that's the reality. The reality is that we, as an administration, are concerned that we need to meet our target and we need to move faster, we need to make progress, right? But at the same time, we also recognize that there are some headwinds, and one of the ways we've tried to frame the conversation around energy bills and fuel bills and things like that is, let's talk about our total energy budget and ways that we can reduce costs across that energy budget for consumers, for businesses, that can support decarbonization and bring the overall energy costs down. So you have to think about it as an overall picture. And there are some areas where we're moving faster than other areas, and I think that's one way to think about how we address affordability and how we try to make things more manageable. But like, this is not easy stuff. Like, we have done the sort of the early stuff, and now it's the slog, and we have to be all in on the slog.
Yeah, Senator or Assemblymember, do you have any thoughts when you hear that we're not near reaching our targets, and then is that an opportunity, or is that a challenge? What does it make you think? Or you don't have to.
I just think, as what was said, the time for playing defense is not now. I actually don't think it's ever. We've got to go on the offensive. We've got to invest in renewable energies. We've got to make a major transition shifting away from our reliance on fossil fuels. We've got to build out the sustainable future that we want. We need the climate bond, but we also need to make sure that our values and the guiding principles that define our budgetary decisions are in place so that we can move California the direction that we deserve. I'm not afraid of reports that are calling on us to do more. Before that report came out, you all were calling on us to do more, and we hear you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I think we know what we need to do to get back on track, and the question is whether California can get out of its own way in getting there, because we have a history of this in the state of identifying very precisely what we need to do in setting very aggressive visionary goals, and then basically putting a million obstacles in the way of actually achieving those goals. So for example, we absolutely need clean energy transition, and we want to electrify everything, which is awesome, but we want to make sure that that electricity is actually clean and not coming from oil or natural gas. And yet, the California Public Utilities Commission continues to take a wrecking ball to rooftop and distributed solar in California. We continue to make it really hard and difficult to cite any kind of transmission. And every time there's a bill to make that more streamlined, it gets torn apart, and that includes offshore wind as well, and so many regulatory steps, ranging from local and regional bodies to the Coastal Commission, and so we are not deploying utility scale clean energy nearly as quickly as we have to. We have to do that faster, exponentially, in addition to distributed. We also know that the dominant or the biggest part of our carbon emissions are transportation, and we're not moving quickly enough to deal with that. And of course, yes, we need to electrify our whole vehicle fleet and have zero emission vehicles, but that is not the complete solution. We have to dramatically expand and shore up our public transportation systems. And we have, even before the pandemic, allowed these systems to just be on a drip, drip, drip and barely surviving and not expanding service in the way that they need to. It's not about badgering people out of their cars. It's about giving people other options that work for them and they want to take. And that will only happen with a profound expansion of public transportation. And yet the state of California has absolutely failed. And we, once in a while, will make a big investment like we did a few years ago, which we then had to defend last year. We don't support the operations of these systems, so they're always on life support. We're going to try to fix that in the Bay Area this year. We did pass permitting reform for rapid bus service and light rail and bike and pedestrian improvements, so that's good, but we have to do more. And then finally, it's housing. When we continue to have these fights and empower people to fight, delay, and obstruct new multi-unit housing near jobs, near transit, in places like San Francisco or Berkeley or Santa Monica or San Diego or wherever else, that is, when people show up and say, I'm opposed to this multi-unit housing here, you are fueling climate change, because that means it's getting built in a sprawl area where there is no transit access and people have to drive more. So all of these, we know what we need to do, let's just get it done.
I have to ask, is now the time to maybe take some of the money from high-speed rail and put it towards other projects?
No, it's both and. Like, can I just say, like, the high-speed rail situation was one of the reasons it's gotten so expensive is because it's taken so damn long, because we have allowed obstructionists to obstruct and delay this throughout the Central Valley and elsewhere. And we have never been able to come together and say that it is embarrassing that the state of California, the fourth largest economy in the world, does not have an actual statewide rail system. That it is embarrassing that if you want to get from the Bay Area to LA, it takes twice as long by train as it does driving. On what planet should that be acceptable? So we can talk about it's not even about high-speed rail, it's about having an actual functioning rail system in the state. We need to get it done, and we need to stop the obstruction.
Okay. And you just yesterday introduced a bond proposal for Bay Area Transit.
It's with Senator Wahab. I'm partnering. It's to authorize the Bay Area to go out to the voters, not with a bond, but with a revenue measure, to permanently shore up operational funding, to fund for transit systems, to fund transit capital, and to fix roads. So it's going to be a big, hard project, but we can get it done, I hope.
Okay. So I feel like the theme of this panel is money. We've got anywhere from a $38 to $73 billion budget deficit, depending on who you ask, as Ellie said earlier. Newsom has proposed $4.7 billion in cuts and delays to climate spending. The Senate put out an early action budget plan last week that calls for cuts to things like water recycling and prescribed fire and hydrogen. How big of a deal are these cuts? What can you do in a down year that moves policy forward that doesn't cost that much money?
You can do a lot to move policy forward, even in a down budget year. And the first thing you can do is make the polluters pay. For far too often and for way too long, frontline communities have been paying for our climate crisis. And they've been paying with their lives. They've been paying with poor health outcomes. They've been paying in almost irreversible ways in some communities. And we've got to change that. That's why actually today, we're introducing a bill that would make the polluters pay for operating stripper wells in the health setback zone. That means a well producing under 15 barrels a day that's right next to a frontline community. For every day that you operate that well where you're producing no oil, you just don't want to clean it up, we're going to charge you a fee going forward. So we just introduced that today. It's going to take... It's going to take all of us to get that kind of work passed, but we've got to shift the cost from the people and shift the cost back to the folks who are harming the people. The other thing that we can do is we can affirm our rights in our state constitution. We can affirm our values, and that doesn't cost anything for us to remind ourselves who California is. California has no environmental language in our state constitution. So we've proposed ACA 16, which will be heard next month in the Natural Resource Committee in the Assembly, the right to clean air, water, and a healthy environment. But with all that being said, that doesn't mean we still don't need our money. And so I'm glad we've got a fantastic new budget chair on the Senate side, and we've got a great budget chair on the Assembly side, because all of these things have to work together. But we can do a lot. Don't let anybody confuse you or trick you into believing that this isn't a climate year. Every year has to be a climate year.
So first of all, I think we're very aligned on the proposals that you just mentioned, so thank you for your leadership on these issues. We have this huge deficit, and to be clear, speaking as the senator from the 11th Senate District, I'm not speaking as budget chair now, I've been more open to revenue solutions than some of our colleagues have been, and revenue is, and we can all identify a lot of different areas around potential revenue solutions. Those have been very challenging in the legislature. Just being honest, we need a 2/3 vote. They're tough. It took us how many years just to pass SB 1 to raise the gas tax, basically by inflation, so that we could fund roads and transit. So to me personally, that is something that I'm very open to. As an institution, it's a lot harder. So we have this huge budget deficit. Just to be clear, we are in a dramatically better place now than we were during the Great Recession. You may recall, for those who were around in the Great Recession in California, where California had no budget reserves, California had to pay employees with IOUs. Can you imagine the state of California paying its employees with IOUs? As a percentage of the general fund, the deficit, even though it was smaller numerically, as a percentage of the general fund, it was much higher. We were seeing horrific things like cutting denture benefits for seniors under Medi-Cal, things that just horrific. So we're in a much better position now. We have over $30 billion in budget reserves instead of zero, because of prudent decisions over the last decade. As a percentage of the general fund, the deficit is smaller. With that said, it still will be painful. The Senate has proposed early action to not for the, I'm not saying everyone will love every part of that, but the hardest decisions will be focused on in May and June after the governors may revise. Our take is let's take some of the action now to reduce the number so that we can, in May, really focus intensively on the absolute hardest decisions we're going to have to make. So that's our take, and we'll work collaboratively with the Assembly on that. We know that 2 years ago, the governor and the legislature, we said the IRA is awesome, but not enough. And so we put about $50 billion in climate investments in the budget with the surplus we had. Now, what that means, it's amazing, but it means that it puts a big target on it, because in terms of making meaningful cuts, there's there will always be a push. Say, let's just take some from there. And we know that we have such an amazing environmental climate advocacy community that it's just important for people to be deeply engaged in that process. So it's going to be a tough few months, but I know there's a lot of great values in our Democratic caucus in both houses, and so I look forward to the process.
All right, we're going to stay on money just for another minute, and then we're going to get back to CARB, which is also about money. So talks are heating up on a climate bond, which is one of the things that Newsom himself floated like 2 years ago, right, as one of the solutions to the cuts to the climate budget. Speaker Rivas was here earlier. He sounded not super committal about a climate bond. He mentioned Prop 1 is, not doing great either. So I'm curious from both of you, what do you think its chances are? What's a realistic dollar figure, given that Rivas said that it's like 15 to 16 billion total on the November ballot? And then a specific question for you, Senator. Which is what do you think has a better chance, a housing bond or a climate bond or an education bond?
Yeah, those are the three things: housing, school facilities, and CSU is very interested in being part of that, so there's that internal conversation, and then the climate bond. First of all, I want to just comment on Prop 1, which I think is not going to pass by the skin of its teeth. You only have to win by one vote, by the way. I think we need to do some, obviously that was a lot closer than anyone expected, and I think we need to do some serious voter research and focus groups about why people didn't support it at the level that we all anticipated. I can't predict for certainty yet, but I'm going to hazard an educated guess that because the focus of Prop 1, it was about homelessness and housing homeless people and homeless policy and mental health and homelessness, it was all around homelessness, that there are people who were just like, you guys don't know what you're doing on homelessness, it's gotten worse, conditions on the streets are so problematic, and so they didn't want to give more money. I might be wrong about that, but I don't automatically interpret the Prop 1 results about being about all bonds. I think there are probably some specific issues around the state's approach to homelessness, mental health, addiction, et cetera, that have gotten people really exasperated with government. But we will see. We're going to have to do some research. And in terms of what's going to go, we have not had our internal Senate conversation about that yet. And I know we have in both houses a lot of varying views. I think all three of these are so incredibly important. And it's really hard to prioritize, but we know that we have so many capital needs around climate and supporting communities' ability to transition their physical infrastructure and improve their resilience. And so that is incredibly important. I hope climate will be part of whatever we do, but it's going to be probably a wild ride in terms of the bond discussion, and we'll see.
Yeah, I think it's not fair to attribute anything that's happening with Prop 1 to expected results that would happen for education, climate, or housing. I think the opposition to Proposition 1, although I can't fully speculate, or I can fully speculate, but I don't fully know all of the various reasons it's had the struggles. I do know one thing that I heard often in community was kind of the technicality of it, people not fully understanding what this does, and fear that we were building kind of giant, large, locked mental health facilities, right? The largest mental health provider in our state is the LA County Jail, by the way. And I put specific language into the legislative effort to make it clear that this couldn't be for jail facilities. But I think the general public is still kind of confused on what this would do, and we also saw a lot of law enforcement in the Prop 1 ads. And so I don't know how much those are all related, but I know that Prop 1 was its own unique measure, and I think that people are very clear about our need to invest in climate change and renewable energy. People are very clear that housing is arguably the number one concern on everybody's mind every single day, or at least every 30 days for all of the renters in the audience like me. And in our education system, I had a long conversation with some folks about this. That is the only bond opportunity where there are no private actors. It's only the public interest who's ever going to fix our school facilities. And so there's a lot of conversation that's got to be had. I definitely think we've got to do something. And I think there's no way to justify the cuts we've made to the climate budget if we're not willing to put some of those things back with the climate bond.
Thanks. Okay. I'm really excited about this next question. I think it goes to the heart of the nature of California's leadership on climate, and we have such a perfect lineup to speak to it. So I'm talking about SB 253, which is Senator Wiener's bill that Newsom signed last year that does require big companies to report their carbon emissions. It would apply to major companies across the country, any that do business in California, so basically all of them. And it's even more important as of 2 weeks ago because the SEC just put out their rule that goes nowhere near as far as California. So California is setting with this law a de facto nationwide standard. Of course, it's been challenged in court. And Newsom, in his budget proposal, did not propose funding it, which I think cost like $9 million. So is that for both of them? $3 million. Sorry, that includes SB 261, which is another bill that requires companies to also disclose the risks that climate change poses to their bottom lines. So I guess let's start with the senator. Okay, so I guess they've made up, so that's great. I'd love to hear your argument for why this is needed, why it's so important to require businesses to calculate and report their emissions, and whether you're going to prioritize it in budget talks as budget chair. And then we can go to Liane.
Yeah, so one thing to note about the non-funding of SB 253, so that's just to be clear, when the governor proposed his budget, he, as far as we can tell, didn't fund any of the chaptered bills that were passed last year.
What other bills? I'm so curious.
Sometimes it's hard to tell because it's in the bowels of all the departments. It's not always a separate line item, but there were many bills that we passed last year and were signed into law, and so he did not fund. So that's a broader. I don't think he targeted SB 253. I have been clear publicly that I don't agree, and he's not the first governor to do this. I think it's very problematic for governors not to fund bills that have been signed into law. Those laws are the law of the land in the state of California. I think it sends a very negative message about the rule of law in California. And again, Governor Newsom Governor Schwarzenegger did it, Governor Davis did it, so this is something that happens periodically, and it should not happen. And I've been very clear we need to fix that and not allow that to happen. The governor made a statement about the legislature should prioritize. We did prioritize last year when we killed many bills and then sent bills to the governor. The governor further prioritized by signing some bills, vetoing other bills, and he vetoed many bills because of cost. So I am confident that SB 253 and other bills that were signed last year are going to be funded and are going to be implemented. And especially, it's so important for 253 because of the SEC. Its proposal was always more limited than 253 because it only applied to publicly traded companies. And we were cheerleading the SEC the whole time. But then the SEC basically at the end really scaled back its proposal dramatically. And then it still got sued. And I think I saw that a federal court of appeals put it on hold. And so there's a challenge about whether the SEC has this authority. So it was always important that California lead here. I am so grateful to my colleagues. Thank you for by the skin of our teeth getting this over to the governor. I am so grateful to the governor for signing it. We've been in conversation with the governor about technical cleanup, and I'm very optimistic we're going to get that done in a way that does not harm the bill or delay it in any way. And I look forward to those continuing conversations with the governor.
I have so many questions based on that, but Liane, can you articulate, is this an important area for California to lead on? Is this somewhere where you want to show leadership? Or? How important is it?
Well, I think it presents huge opportunities in terms of, one of the things I think about as we think about our regulatory work is what incentivizes companies to push forward and adopt technologies that need to be adopted. And, one of the ways they can do that, one of their motivations is reducing their emissions. And so, having a framework that says, okay, here's the emissions, I think that can prompt action. I think, I agree with Senator Wiener's assessment. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're assuming that, it will get funded and we will be able to do some hiring and we will be able to get going. With regard to the SEC, it's interesting because, a federal court did enjoin it partly on the argument of whether or not the SEC had authority to do it, right? Because it's an administrative action. In California, we're in a much different situation, right? Because it's a legislative action. As we're thinking about, as one of the named defendants in the lawsuit, personally, I feel, we are joining hands with the Attorney General, and I feel pretty confident that we can stave off any legal challenges.
So one of the sticking points with businesses in their fight over this rule was Scope 3, which is the emissions related to a company's entire supply chain, which are hard to calculate, right? Or maybe they're not. I'm curious, how important you think Scope 3 is to include in implementation, both of you.
It's 100% essential. Had during our legislative process, had Scope 3 been removed from the bill, I would have immediately abandoned the bill. It would not have been worth passing. As much as 80, 90% of corporate carbon emissions are in Scope 3. And if you don't include Scope, the whole point of this is transparency. It is ensuring that we know who is emitting a lot and who isn't, who's promoting themselves as green when they're not, who's walking the walk, who's talking the talk. And if you allow corporations to just contract out their carbon emissions to third parties and through their supply chain, then you're getting a very, very misleading picture. So Scope 3 is absolutely essential. We know that Scope 3 can be challenging because of global supply chains, and we don't want to drag in every micro supplier around the world. And so very early on in the 3-year legislative process, we worked with the business community to say, okay, we hear you. If you have some micro supplier in Indonesia or in Lebanon, we don't want you to have to force that, track all that down when they might not be in a position to provide it or might not have the ability to provide it. And so we allowed for use of formulas and estimates for Scope 3. And so the opposition continued to the end to misrepresent that and claim they were going to have to track down that little micro supplier in Ontario or in Chile, and that was just completely false. And we also need to be very clear about what's going on here. Nothing that we passed as part of SB 253 is new. It's all existing methodology that some of the largest companies in the world are already doing. They're already calculating their Scope 3, and some of them are doing it very, very well. And so this whole notion this is expensive, it's not. It's difficult, it's not. It's impossible, it's not. You have to ask yourself, and then they file this lawsuit, and it's one of the most bizarre lawsuits I've ever seen. It was cooked up in some Uber MAGA basement somewhere. That level of crazy. And the reason that they're doing this, we need to be very clear. It was the Chamber of Commerce was the lead, but it was the oil industry, it was the banks. They don't want people to know how much they're fueling climate change. They just don't want the public to know. They want to be able to keep it behind the curtain. That's all this is about. And so I agree with the chair that that lawsuit, I think we'll be able to defeat it and then move forward.
Thanks. Liane, so scope 3, is it worth asking businesses that you're already planning to tighten the cap and trade cap on and, subject to other regulations, is it worth asking them to calculate their scope 3 emissions?
Well, the entities subject to the legislation are far broader than the covered entities under cap and trade. So, it's going to provide much more information than we have now. I think, scope 3 is challenging. I think it remains to be seen sort of how consistent comparisons are going to be. And so I think, the way the bill's structured, which is like, okay, we're going to use this particular protocol for reporting for a while and see how it goes. And then at a point in the future, CARB can assess, is that the right protocol? Is that the right thing? I think that makes a lot of sense, because I think we do need to understand sort of, is that protocol the right level of consistency? Our view of the world is we have the mandatory reporting rules, which are incredibly technical, incredibly detailed, and, to the senator's point, that's not what this is. This is not this incredibly technical requirement. It can be based on what your business activities are, and it allows for some flexibility in how you're gathering your data and presenting your data. So I think, I think it could be incredibly useful. I think it'll be, we're going to have to do some work to implement it. And this is one of the areas of disagreement that we've had, of how much time is it going to take for us to get these, at least the first tranche of rules in place. And but we will work hard to get it done, as we always do.
And are we already too late for it to be able to take effect in January 2025? No? You guys can write the rules in 7-8 months?
I don't know if you've read the Administrative Procedures Act, but I guess I think already just the fact that the law has passed, companies know it's coming. I think that's a big step, and we will move with alacrity as soon as we, is that the right use of that word? As soon as we get our funding going. I mean, we're already conceptually, the leadership within the agency is thinking about, okay, what are we going to need? What are the steps we're going to take? What are the resources we're going to need with, specificity? So we're already kind of setting ourselves up. And I have spent a lot of time talking to experts in the field, who have put together these protocols. I have a meeting this afternoon on the exact topic. So, we will do what we can as quickly as we can.
Okay, so one more question on 253. This is, okay, so what does cleanup mean then? This is the most loaded use I've ever heard of cleanup. What does that mean to you, Senator?
Well, we've been in conversation with the governor's office, and I'm very optimistic. What cleanup means is making technical changes to the bill to make sure that it's as easy and straightforward to implement as possible and that there's no ambiguities. Cleanup does not mean delaying implementation. Cleanup does not mean scaling back or watering down what the bill requires. And so that's what cleanup means to me, and I am optimistic we'll be able to get that done.
Okay, great. Okay. Moving on. Hydrogen, specific technology that's getting a lot of hype and potentially a lot of money. There's an intense debate going on right now within California and the rest of the country about how to regulate hydrogen production and what requirements the feds should place on hydrogen produced from electricity to access the most valuable tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. Environmental groups want standards that they're calling the 3 pillars, which I won't list all of them, but one of them is that hydrogen generation should be powered only by newly built clean energy sources so that it doesn't use up existing resources because it's so energy intensive. But Arches, which is the state-backed hydrogen hub that's competing for federal money, is advocating that California already has so many renewable energy requirements and so many targets for clean energy that it shouldn't have to comply with those standards. So this is a question for everyone, but Assemblymember, at a recent Hydrogen Select Committee hearing, you asked, are we not just trying to escape the federal regulatory framework so that we can regulate ourselves and give ourselves an out? So do you think... I said what you said, so now you can say more about it. Do you think that California hydrogen projects should have to abide by the 3 pillars?
Well, past me said what I believe is kind of an honest question about where this conversation is. And I have to give a lot of credit to my colleague, Steve Bennett from Ventura. Assemblymember Bennett has been deeply engaged in this conversation in trying to get it right. He chairs that very same select committee where we're trying to understand this landscape in a very real and honest and intentional way. There's no reason California shouldn't be a spot for all renewable energy creation, especially if there are federal dollars attached. We pay more money into the federal government as a state than we get back. So when money's coming back for new and clean energy, we've got to be at the top of that list, but we've got to make sure that it is in fact clean energy. And what is green hydrogen? And those 3 pillars, I think, are very, very worthy of a conversation. Yes, we have a regulatory framework that is far ahead of many other states that are competing for those dollars, which in my mind begs the question, then does that not give us an advantage in complying with the 3 pillars? And so we've got to have these conversations. We're having them in the select committee process. I expect Assemblymember Steve Bennett to reintroduce or to update a bill he's already introduced on this conversation. So if you are interested, stay engaged with that select committee. Stay engaged in this conversation. You only get one chance to build out a new industry, right? You only get one chance to lay the foundation for doing something right. And so here in California, we've got to make sure when it comes to this hydrogen conversation, we start by doing it right.
Okay, great. I wasn't keeping track of time. This was such an engrossing conversation, but we're out of time. So I'll just hand all these audience questions over to you guys. And you can, if there's any that you want to answer, but also just, feel free to let constituents approach you and you can talk about it offline. Okay, thank you, everyone.
I think we need to give them a much more rousing applause. That was phenomenal. They're having the real conversations that have to happen about some of the hardest issues we face. So thank you all so much. Really. Wow. I took a lot of notes during that one. So, we organize all of this so that if I could organize the best conference I personally would love to go to, this is it. And so, who could have a better day than to learn from one another, have some of our climate champions here talking about these incredible issues, and really have a chance to address the biggest challenges of our time. Before I move on, I want to acknowledge all the Climate Center staff that organized this event. I didn't do it, they did it. So please stand up. Climate Center staff, please stand up. Wave. Thank you all so much for a phenomenal job organizing this day. Really excellent. Thank you. All right. So now I'm very pleased to bring up Elena. Are you there? There you are. Okay, come on up, Elena. California is laying the groundwork to scale up nature-based climate solutions using strategies like urban tree planting and regenerative agriculture. New regional carbon farming hubs are uniquely positioned to help farmers and ranchers implement nature-based climate solutions. We're going to hear about these new hubs and how they can help landowners pull carbon out of the atmosphere. That's what we call sequestration, not that other one, CC, whatever. Okay, while improving soil health, water efficiency, food security, and biodiversity. So I'm really pleased to have with us Dr. Elena Bischak. who is the statewide coordinator for the Resource Conservation District Regional Ag and Climate Hub. She is also the agricultural program manager at the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts and a great partner. She got her PhD in environmental systems at UC Merced. She became interested in climate beneficial agriculture during her time as a Peace Corps volunteer in central Senegal. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Elena Bischak.
Yeah. Where's it? What do I click?
That's a great question. I guess that's forward, right in the middle there.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much to the Climate Center for hosting us today, and to our previous panel that was really illuminating. So yeah, my name is Elena Bischak, and I am at the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, or CARCD. And today I'll be presenting our RCD Regional Ag and Climate Hubs program. So if you're unfamiliar, resource conservation districts, or RCDs, work all across the state and have over 85 years of conservation experience at the local level. RCDs were established across the nation. They kind of have different names in different states, but after the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, to facilitate voluntary conservation of natural resources on our natural and working lands. And this looks different across RCDs across the state, but this includes habitat restoration, forest health, healthy soils, public education, disaster preparedness, and landscape scale conservation planning. So something that's really important about RCDs is that they always work with their constituents on a voluntary basis, which is something that's been really important to making them instrumental in implementing conservation in their communities. RCDs provide technical assistance, which is really critical in meeting our climate goals for our natural and working lands. Technical assistance looks really different and diverse across the scope of a project. This can include building relationships and trust, which is something RCDs do really well since they're so well established in our communities, developing conservation plans, environmental compliance, design and engineering, implementation funding from a diversity of sources, including federal funding, and project management. So now I want to introduce you carbon farming. If you're unfamiliar, carbon farming is a whole farm approach to optimizing carbon capture on working landscapes by implementing practices that increase the rate of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere for storage and plant material and soil organic matter. And really what that means is looking at a parcel scale, a farm scale, and developing a plan that can maximize how much carbon can be stored in biomass. And this might look like things you're familiar with, like compost application, low-till, no-till, cover cropping, but also things like repairing riparian areas on our working lands. So recognizing the importance of RCDs as implementers of conservation agricultural practices and of carbon farming as a tool to do this, that's been really important in California, now across the country. This led to the establishment of the RCD Regional Ag and Climate Hubs program I'm presenting to you today. This is a partnership between CARCD, our lovely host, the Climate Center, and the Carbon Cycle Institute, the pioneers of carbon farm planning, or carbon farming. This is a 3-year, $3 million grant granted to us by the Patterson Family Foundation that supports the development of our statewide network of 7 RCD Regional Ag and Climate Hubs, looking to scale climate beneficial ag throughout the state by supporting RCDs in doing that, with a focus on investment specifically in soil health through carbon farm planning. And really in this scope of work, we're focused on identifying the barriers and solutions to implementation at scale, ultimately to advocate for policy that better supports RCDs in doing this work and getting more conservation on the ground to sequester that carbon. So I'll present you with this information at the end, but I just encourage you to reach out to your local regional coordinator to see how you can be involved in local conservation work at their RCD Regional Ag and Climate Hub. My name is Elena Bischak. As I mentioned, we have Margot Flynn in the Sac Valley, Emily Winfield in the North Coast, Josh Curry in the Central Coast, Matthew Lunn in the Central Sierra region, Alexandria Miranda in the our beautiful San Joaquin Valley, and Rachel Pettit down south in Southern California. So you can see the extent of our growing network. And I just want to assert that investing in soil health practices that build soil carbon, extends beyond climate change mitigation. So climate change mitigation is obviously really important in what we're talking about today. Implementing practices that improve and increase soil organic matter will sequester carbon in the soil, but they also can lead to better food security outcomes through nutrient provision from that soil organic matter, but also a healthier soil is more resilient against future climate shocks. Also, biodiversity is something that's, we all know is really important, both within the soil itself, but also providing the basis of a habitat for wildlife and pollinators on that agroecosystem. Public health is something we should, we're all concerned about. We're all familiar with the dust that comes into the air during the almond harvest, and if all those soils were healthier, there would be less wind erosion, and that would pose less of a public health risk. But also, healthier soils require less pesticide inputs, and they also will emit less nitrate flows or pesticide flows, in phosphorus flows. I could go on and on into the environment. Also, water conservation, something we're all aware of and concerned about. Healthy soils allow water to infiltrate into them more readily and also store more water. A healthy soil acts like a sponge. A soil that has not been invested in acts like a slide. So you're going to see runoff into our surface waters and also less filtration of that water to protect our groundwater resources. And also profit. Studies have shown that investing in soils long term for even as short as 3 years can lead to increased profit, mostly from reduced production costs. And what we're looking at right now in our regional needs and opportunity assessment for our hubs is understanding what does ag look like on a regional basis within the hub, what past ag and climate assessment work has been done in the region, and critically, how do RCDs support their ag and climate programs now? Because this is really diverse across RCDs. Also, what is a specific regional climate risk? This is going to be very different between the San Joaquin Valley and the North Coast, for example. What partnerships support RCDs in bolstering their ag and climate programs, and what opportunities exist to better support those partnerships? And ultimately, we want to understand what is the opportunity to regionally scale our climate beneficial ag practices. Specifically, how much technical and financial assistance is necessary to do that, to meet our regional climate mitigation goals, and what would be the net greenhouse gas mitigation potential of implementation at scale. And really what we're hoping to understand is moving across the scales of conservation that goes on within our state, from the field and farm scale where a carbon farm plan is implemented and developed, up to the state scale where policies and targets are set. And we hope that close collaboration between our hubs can better support this relationship of scales. So if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to scan these QR codes. You can get the contact info for our coordinators on the right-hand side, and then the left is my business card. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. One of the huge issues that we don't talk a lot about in the climate community is food security and what we do, how we manage food production in states like California is huge for the future of all of us. So thank you for what you're doing and the climate hubs, and it's great to partner together. I have a couple questions for you. Well, first, I just want to point out, we have a gentleman here, Warren, would you raise your hand, who is from the Tulare RCD. Welcome, Warren. We're glad to have you here. I don't know, is there anybody else associated with other RCDs across the state who's here today? No, so just to show who typically shows up for a climate conference, and we need to work much more with the RCD and with the ag community. It's a critical part of our future for food, for water, and much more. So this is fascinating to me that almost every other state in the country pays some amount of money in its annual budget. I should have had Senator Wiener still here, for RCDs, to have staff and to help ensure that local farmers and landowners can take advantage of federal and state programs to advance conservation on their lands. But California, amazingly, does not have that at all. So what do we need to do to get California to help us scale up this kind of work that's so vital that the RCDs do?
So the answer there is we need investment in our RCDs. yeah, as Ellie said, California is one of the only states that doesn't invest in their conservation districts, and oftentimes counties will provide funds to their local conservation districts. That doesn't usually happen in California either. So this is a massive missed opportunity. California also has, super ambitious climate mitigation goals, and a lot of that pertains to agriculture. We have the most important agricultural economy in the country. You can make the argument in the world. We produce food for the world, but we're not investing in the people on the ground that do conservation work in agriculture.
That's great. Well, let's give Dr. Elena Bischak a big round of applause. Thank you for your leadership. Fantastic. I am now thrilled to introduce our next fabulous panel. Please come on up. This is a panel on delivering on the 100% clean energy vision with the grid for the future. So 100% clean energy grid is foundational to achieving California's climate goals. The state also needs to take full advantage of the benefits available from distributed energy resources, like I talked about earlier, including electric vehicles. This panel will explore what policies are needed to support a clean, resilient, and reliable electricity system, and what legislative and regulatory action is moving forward this year. Again, remember to put your questions on your cards. I think everybody's an expert at that now. And so I want to welcome up Senator Becker, CPUC Commissioner Darcie Houck, Walker Wright, VP of the Public Policy at Sunrun, and our moderator, Rosanna Herber. Take it away, Rosanna.
All right.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you got that?
All right, here we go. One thing that we're not going to do is introductions. We figure you can look that up on the app and find out great things about all these people. I do want to say I'm Rosanna Herber, the SMUD board president, and as many of you know, we have set the goal of being zero carbon by 2030. Yeah. And we are well on our way to achieving that. However, we can't do this without investments in the grid. And so we know that we need to have the grid in place to be able to handle all the renewable energy. And so what we're going to do is have each of the speakers speak for 8 minutes. If you have questions as they're talking, raise your hand and someone will come by and get them. But let's go ahead, and we're going to start off with Walker Wright, and then the senator, and then Darcie. So Walker Wright, welcome.
Is this on? Well, fantastic to be here. Walker Wright with Sunrun. I think most of the folks in the room are aware of Sunrun. It's definitely a California story, founded at Stanford Graduate School of Business in 2007. We are approaching 1 million solar homes. So if you think about that, that's about 4 million people waking up every day and sort of looking up and seeing that locally generated power. More importantly to this conversation, we're approaching 100,000 battery customers, which I think we also need to get into. Since April 13th of 2023, more than 95% of our installations here in California are with batteries. And a major focus of our CEO, Mary Powell, is how we can leverage these resources to help the grid, to help the environment, and crucially to help all ratepayers to drive down costs. So I think that'll be a focus throughout this conversation, how we can leverage things. And I also wanted to say, after this conference, I've been to this conference I think 3 or 4 years in a row. It gets better every year. This year, from this speaking arrangement, I'm getting on a flight, the red eye to go to Amsterdam. And there's a conference tomorrow called The Utility of the Future and the Electricity Customer of the Future. And you're going to see me wearing these same exact clothes. I'm going to wake up, I'm going to brush my teeth, and we're going to talk about similar stuff in Europe. And I think that the fact that this conversation is happening in Australia, in Germany, the Netherlands, the world is asking the similar questions. How can we leverage distributed resources to drive down costs for everyone, and also crucially make consumers really feel proud of being part of this climate revolution? Okay. One thing that I also wanted to do in this talk is really acknowledge the institutions and the individual sitting next to me right now. And it has to start where we are right now in SMUD territory. So, hands, who here is familiar with the PV Pioneer Program? Okay, so PV Pioneer Program, whenever I go to a conference in Japan or Europe, they always talk about SMUD. SMUD was the original utility that drove forward some of these original technologies. Back in the early 1990s, the PV Pioneer Program got up and running, and it was figuring out how to get people to install rooftop solar. At the same time, SMUD was also experimenting with the Rancho Seco facility, providing amorphous silicon panels. So at one point in the early 2000s, you should definitely know this, that more than half of the grid-tied PV in the entire world was in SMUD alone, right? And so whenever I go to these conferences overseas, people will ask about SMUD, and I just have to imagine somewhere within SMUD there's a trophy cabinet, because I know that many of the executives back in those days were getting awards for that innovative spirit. So SMUD really set the pathway forward, and then you have to fast forward a few years past the 1990s and go into the early 2000s and look at the California legislative body and the PUC, which were providing the initial signals for what eventually became the California Solar Initiative, right? So when was the California Solar Initiative passed? 2006, right? And so if you look back at the California Solar Initiative, there originally was a very high subsidy, a rebate program, ratepayer funded, and the idea was to put that out there and create a competitive environment for the industry to drive down costs. So, Senator Becker sitting next to me, he has a lot of familiarity with the venture capital world, with competition, with innovation in California. Only because of this type of framework that was available, that's what drove the scale and the investment necessary to create what you see at Sunrun today in 2024 with this many customers. But it's that signal that creates that innovation and that competition, which is what gets us here. Right? So we just need to sort of remember the history. And at the time, this was not easy. So, the previous panel was a legislative panel. It took 3 years to pass the California Solar Initiative, 2004, 5, 6. There were lots of fights. This is never going to happen. The industry is never going to drive down costs, right? So it was very real. It was political. People, the knives were out. People pushed through and eventually got there. There was also a lot of interplay at the time between the PUC and the legislative body. Having trouble with the legislature, what can the PUC do to make better implementation policies, right? So let's just keep our minds focused on everything is hard. And now, let's to bring this full circle. When I go over to Europe, or I was in Japan last year having similar conversations. Now that Sunrun has some subsidiaries, we have tens of thousands of batteries on the grid, and everyone's asking this question: how can we get value from those batteries for every customer? I think it's also appropriate, and would love the feedback from the rest of this panel, for California to ask, what can we learn from other states and other countries? What are they doing, right? I'm from New Jersey, more Bruce Springsteen than Bon Jovi, but you look at their DG world. We can ask questions about that. We can look at Hawaii, what they're doing to get the value of those exported electrons during peak. We can look at Germany and Australia, which have far higher penetrations of rooftop solar with 0 subsidies. How are they doing that? Why are the soft costs so much lower in Australia, Germany, than the Netherlands compared to California? What goes into those soft costs? So I think that's really where we need to be today. Continue to have California be the leader, and also acknowledge that I guarantee you tomorrow, I'm going to get questions about SMUD. I'm going to get questions about, only Sunrun can come out of California. You'll hear that often. But you'll also, I guarantee you tomorrow and the next day, I'll get questions of, why is the grid so expensive to maintain in California? Why are rates so high there now compared? So in Europe, they'll say rates have gone up a lot recently due to the Ukraine war. It's a different story here, right? Why is SMUD much different than PG&E? Right? Those are the questions I get. In a previous job, I advised a French energy company on rate design and US regulatory policy, and they were always asking those questions. Why is DWP so different than SCE? Why is PG&E different than SMUD? Those are really difficult questions to explain to someone overseas who's looking at our electricity markets. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you. This is a fantastic conference, and it's a real privilege to be next to these folks who are leading the way.
All right. First of all, it's great to be in a room of clean energy leaders, climate advocates. Give yourselves a round of applause. Thank you all for making it up here. It's super exciting for me, and I'm going to stay as long as I can. I have caucus here, so may not be able to stay for all of the Q&A. I have, this is really about the grid. So it seems like a pretty wonky audience. This is a pretty wonky audience here? I think it's a pretty wonky audience. Okay. All right, so we're going to get a little bit wonky today, and I'm just going to get into it. Maybe fewer applause lines, but maybe, you can applaud for some of this too if you want. The electrical grid powered by clean energy is foundational to everything else we want to do, right? We don't get the benefits of electric vehicles if we're still burning lots of fossil fuels powering our grid. So we need clean electricity for, two of my biggest priorities, for buildings and transportation, which are collectively about, call it 65% of our carbon emissions today. We also need green hydrogen and other clean fuels for things that we will need for airplanes and ships. We'll also even need it for certain types of carbon removal, which we'll need to get all the way to net zero. The good news, we already have pretty good targets for the grid. 60% clean energy by 2030. Clean energy serving 100% of retail sales by 2045, with 90% by 2035. My bill, SB 1158 from 2022, is going to require an honest accounting of GHG emissions from the grid based on hourly accounting of clean energy versus load. That kicks in 2026. The one target all right, we can applaud for that. Thank you. Yes, that's a wonky person right there. The one target we really need to still fix is making sure that 100% means 100%. Right now, 100% of retail sales doesn't cover 100% of generation. Our energy agencies assume we still have almost 10% of generation coming from fossil gas plants. So that doesn't really add up, when we think about 100%. So that's something we have to do, making sure 100% means 100% statewide. But that's a conversation for another day. Thank you. We can applaud for that too. All right, I like it. We're going well. So we have good targets, but other than that, we don't need a lot more targets. We need to accelerate our execution, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. How can we build clean energy faster? And I'm going to talk about 4 categories. First, we need more distributed generation, energy efficiency, and flexibility closer to home. All right, excellent. So every megawatt closer means that's something that we don't have to deliver from far away, which we will talk about in a moment. So we have to find the right balance for encouraging distributed solar, without driving up rates for non-solar customers. My bill, SB 1374 this year, tries to restore that balance for schools and farms and apartment buildings where the recent virtual net metering changes, have taken away the ability to benefit from self-consuming locally generated power. So that's really important. We also need a functional community solar program, and this is something that 22 other states have, and it was looking like we're making progress on this. There was a recent decision that I'm not a fan of. I think there's still a chance to reevaluate that, and we will discuss that going forward, but we need a functional community solar program like 22 other states. Thank you. And we've got to make it easier for consumers to benefit from shifting their load away from peak hours for the demand response aggregators who help them get rewarded for their work. And we need to make sure, we can applaud for that, please. We're going to need a lot more demand flexibility and make sure that the utilities are actually sharing data. So we have to make sure that there's some really foundational things that we have to do there. Second, we need to widen the pipes, invest in transmission and distribution so we can deliver more clean power from where we can build it to where we all live and work. So right now, there's many, as all of you know, multi-year delays in getting projects built because we don't have enough transmission capacity to deliver it. Hundreds of products waiting in queue at CAISO for approval, and again, they can't get financed and built. So this is our biggest bottleneck right now. So I had a big transmission planning bill, SB 887 in 2022. Again, that's sort of helping, but there's a lot we have to do. Closer to home, we can't get things connected to the grid, right? It was taking 50 weeks to get new high capacity electric chargers connected to the grid. Unfortunately, last year I passed SB 410, which has now become a national model. So I've been talking to charging companies across the country. This just got recently introduced in Illinois, for example. Yes, we do need to learn from other states and other countries as well, but we can still obviously lead here. So SB 410 is going to basically pairs that workforce piece with the accountability piece with targeted resources for the probably $1 billion plus a backlog of stuff we have to get connected to the grid. Third, we need to build a lot more. How much time do I have?
You're fine.
Okay. Third, we need to build a lot more utility scale solar, wind, and battery storage. So this is not an argument about utility versus distributed resources. We obviously need lots of both and a huge amount of both. And as we talked about, lack of transmission is a big barrier for this project, but so is permitting. I like to see wind turbines in the breeze. Maybe not everyone shares our view. We've got a lot of local resistance that's blocking a lot of these projects across the state. And there's also a lot of misinformation that's being put out there about these projects. So we made some sensible permitting reforms last year, and such as opt-in CEQA siting and permitting by the CEC. But really, this is an area we need lots more work to be done. And fourth, we need more non-traditional clean energy resources. So solar, wind, and batteries, fantastic. They're not going to be everything that we need to get to 100%. So we need more sources of clean power that can balance out the variable resources and focusing on that peak, that 5 to 9 o'clock peak that we all here, I know you all here know about. So offshore wind is an important resource that's perfectly inversely coordinated with our onshore wind, and solar central procurement, which we authorized last year, is going to be helpful towards that, but it's still a long timeline, and there's a lot that we need to do with federal and state resources to support it. We need more dispatchable clean power like geothermal, and we need to make it easier to develop here in California. Recently, we learned that CalGEM, you need them to lead a CEQA evaluation, even to drill an exploratory well for geothermal. And CalGEM has a multi-year backlog for everything, so we need to fix this and make sure that innovative geothermal projects can get permitted much easier. And we also need new forms of long-duration energy storage. This might mean green hydrogen, if it's actually green, got a couple bills on that, or new kinds of ultra-low-cost batteries, but we need something to fill that category at gigawatt scale. We just can't get to 100% clean energy without filling those gaps. So to recap, path to 100% clean energy is all four of these things: distributed energy and demand flexibility, widening pipes with transmission and distributed expansion, a lot more utility scale solar, wind, and batteries, and fourth, support for emerging types of clean energy. And the most important thing is that a movement that unites us all in support of these goals, right? It can't be one versus another, one part of our movement versus another part of the movement. This really has to be an all-of-the-above strategy. Recently, as you saw, the study came out, we're not on track to meet our 2030 goals. So we really need an all-of-the-above approach, and look forward to working with all of you towards that end. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And then last but not least, Darcie Houck.
Hi, is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I want to thank the Climate Center for including me in today's event, and all of you for coming out. This is a great turnout, which just shows how important all of these issues are to California. Again, I'm Darcie Houck. I'm one of the 5 commissioners at the California Public Utilities Commission, and I am the lead commissioner on our high DER proceeding. That is a quasi-ledge proceeding, so I am allowed to talk about it in public. I am going to talk a little bit about demand flexibility at a very high policy level, but not get into any substance in our demand flexibility proceeding, because that is a rate-setting proceeding, which I cannot talk about here, otherwise it will violate ex parte rules. But again, demand flexibility is something that I think is very critical, as well as distributed energy resources. The Commission adopted a distributed energy resource plan, and then a distributed energy resource plan 2.0 was adopted 2 years ago. And these plans recognize the importance of DERs, and when I talk about DERs, I'm talking about that in a broad perspective. That includes load flexibility, demand response, energy efficiency, behind the meter tools, and just also transportation and building decarbonization efforts and all of the things that Senator Becker had listed. Historically, the electric power system was designed under the assumption that customer demand for electricity was inflexible, and for the majority of the past 100 years, that approach made sense. Customer demand was inflexible. We didn't have widespread access to tools and technologies needed to send time-varying price signals or efficiently schedule end-use loads, nor did we need it because our energy supply was flexible. Utilities could dispatch fossil fuel power plants in real time to match customer demand. That's not the case anymore as we're making our transition to our SB 100 goals. The California landscape looks very different, and the state's renewable penetration and greenhouse gas reduction goals have transitioned a large part of our energy supply to intermittent resources, wind and solar. And this requires that we accommodate that, and we have a grid that can meet the needs of these resources and be able to address automation of appliances, of looking at how we use energy needs to be something that we embed in what we're doing at the commission when we're looking at our procurement, when we're looking at rate design, when we're looking at all of these things. Load flexibility, in my opinion as an individual commissioner, is critical to meeting our SB 100 goals, and it's going to be critical to ensuring that we can have 100% renewable energy on the grid by 2045. And we need to embed energy efficiency and demand response and start investing in those measures, and looking at how to get visibility on the grid at the ISO level for what we're doing with demand response, with virtual power plants, and all of these resources. I think the Energy Commission recently estimated that there is roughly 7,000 megawatts that we could be gathering on the demand side that are going unaccounted for. And we need to build into our regulatory processes and what we're doing with our grid development to basically utilize those unutilized resources at the moment. And that's going to require a grid that can meet these goals. And it's going to require educating customers and creating the right signals for customers to do their part. It's not without challenges. Upgrading our grid costs a lot of money, and we have to be accountable to ratepayers for affordability. We've got a lot of vulnerable customers in California that are having problems paying their electric bills right now, and we've got to make sure that we're embedding equity in what we're doing and how we're doing it, and we need to ensure that in doing that, we're sending the right signals to customers, to the utilities, and to the generators to make sure that we're able to move this transition in a way that, again, is affordable, reliable, and safe. We've got a lot of challenges with climate change and wildfires that we're dealing with that also cost a lot of money. We have to have a safe grid for this to work, and we have to have a reliable grid. You know, SB 410 is looking at the energization issues, and we're moving very quickly with our proceeding to adopt the processes that are embedded in SB 410. We have our high distributed energy resource proceeding, which is looking at what the grid of the future looks like. That proceeding is looking at data issues. We have a specific track that is focused on data, what the smart grid of the future looks like. There's a data working group that we're looking at in that proceeding, as well as in the avoided cost calculator proceeding. There's a track 2 looking at data issues. We know that we have to do things differently, and we have to look at grid planning differently in order to get the grid of the future. And we just released a staff proposal in our high DER proceeding last week. I know a number of folks here are probably following or parties to that proceeding. I encourage you to look at it and file your comments. We need to hear from you. Early on in that proceeding, we made an effort to go out and meet with local planning agencies, with tribal entities, CBOs, IOUs, CCAs, and others to see what is happening at the localized level. We recognize with intermittent resources and high penetration of DERs, we need a different way of forecasting and a different way of planning for our grid that has to have a localized component to it to make sure that that's being factored in along with our statewide forecast that's done by the California Energy Commission. And the staff proposal that we issued is looking at how to embed those pending projects and those localized needs into what we're doing at, for our utility grid needs assessments, and that's going to be critical. We're also looking at gaps that we see with distribution system operation. We have contracted with GridWorks to help facilitate a series of workshops. One was in February, one was just recently in March. There's another one that's going to be in April. That series, again, is looking at different gaps. It's looking at how we can fill those gaps. It's asking questions. We've had a number of presenters from across the country that have presented things that they're doing that could really be useful to how we're operating our grid. So I encourage you, if you haven't seen those workshops, they were recorded, they are on our website, and again, the third one will be in April, and we're taking feedback, and there'll be a report that comes out soon. We're also looking at a track 3 that will have a report on the smart grid components that we're going to need to make sure we've got a grid that functions for what we need to be doing to reach our 2045 goals, and also looking at cybersecurity. That is also a critical component, especially with high penetration of DERs distributed across our grid. We need to make sure it's a secure, safe grid, and again, the costs that we're looking at have to be affordable for our customers as well. But, you know, the state had on its books load management standards in the 70s. The technology wasn't there at the time, it is now. And the technology, as we all know, is moving very, very quickly. The capabilities that we have to be able to operate a grid that can have automated appliances where people don't even have to think about the price signals and what's happening is right at our fingertips. And so we need to really look hard at the policies that we're addressing now, because the technology's there. The ability to ensure that we get to our SB 100 goals is here. We can do this. We just need to have the right policies in place to make sure that it is affordable, especially for our most vulnerable populations, that we're not leaving behind communities. We all saw the articles regarding Humboldt County, I think Madera. I actually spent 10 hours up in Humboldt County touring the system to see parts of the distribution system that needs serious upgrades. With offshore wind coming in, we need the transmission planning, and hopefully that will also, we can look at having some task force across the state in specific areas to make sure that those needs are getting embedded in what we're doing. So again, I want to just really reiterate, with all of the efforts that we're making with decarbonization, both in buildings and transportation, we need a grid that's going to be able to accommodate it. We are moving very quickly. We have a lot to look at. It's not an easy task to balance the affordability, reliability, and safety issues, but there's a lot of opportunities here for the entire state. California has been a global leader on these issues forever, and I think we're going to continue to do that. It's going to be a bumpy ride as we move through this, I think, as some people have seen and commented on, but we're going to get there, and demand response and demand flexibility are going to be absolutely critical to seeing us get there, and we need a grid that accommodates that to make it happen.
Wonderful, wonderful. How about a hand for the panel? Woo. We do just have a couple of minutes, and I would like to have the senator answer this question, if possible. A little controversial here. I understand how rooftop solar credits were not always equitable, but the newly enacted regulation to cut back on credits has significantly cut back on rooftop solar installations. What do you think is the answer?
Well, first of all, by the way, I'm reminded by your comments, you know, that passing bills, I want to say it's easy, but the implementation is certainly very hard, and I'm just really grateful to those in our agencies who are working every day on the nuts and bolts of the implementation of all of this legislation and trying to do that balancing. So I really appreciate that. As regards to solar, I won't get into all the details of this. Obviously, I think it's been clear sort of why some of the changes were made, and the question is finding that balance, as we talked about. The current laws do encourage batteries, and so companies that do have access to batteries can encourage those, and we have to do a lot of education for people around those. But solar companies that don't have a lot of access to batteries are really significantly suffering as a result of the changes. So, I probably would have liked to see more of a glide path, but I do understand why some of the changes were made over time. I do think that, again, we overcorrected in certain areas, and that's why I have a bill particularly focusing on schools and farms and apartment buildings, that we really restore some of that. Doesn't make sense if you're a school and you have 2 meters and for your parking lot, you have to sell back to the grid for not a lot of value, and then you have to pay full rate for your school when you actually can connect those two. So that's the kind of thing that we fix with this bill. So I think there is room to fix, and we do have to make sure that we still value distributed solar, which also I would say, including community solar, I think that's something that does need to be fixed, in my opinion, for sure, and we'll have a hearing on that on Thursday. You're all welcome to come for our budget subcommittee. So I think there's work to do to make sure we find the right balance.
And I know we're out of time, but you've got that microphone close to your mouth, so you get to have the last word.
No, Sunrun is a public company. When we do layoffs, we do trigger warn notices here in the state of California. So it has been in the press, and it is very real, the amount of layoffs that have occurred across the rooftop solar industry and within Sunrun. One thing that I just want to highlight is that when I started coming to Sacramento, and we were talking about making sure that rooftop solar could get to as many communities as possible, at the time there was very little solar that was going on care customers, right, low-income customers across the state, and that was due to financing challenges and the industry needing to scale. There were a few pieces of legislation in 2011, 12, and 13 that, had they passed, the penetration would be much higher now than it is today. But I want to highlight that in 2022, every quarter, Sunrun was doing between 25 and 30% of our customers were care customers, right? So major progress was done there, and we just need to continue to focus on what the value proposition is and recognize that whether it's care customers, Senator Becker mentioned schools, multifamily, we're very invested in the multifamily business right now. I want to give a shout out to the SOMA program at the PUC for really driving that market. People who have DG like it. If you look at whether in this state, across the world, other states, when there are DG proceedings taking place at the PUC, when there are bills in the legislative body, people get involved at a far higher level than any other environmental or clean energy issue. And that's the reason. The reason for that is that they feel they're connected to something really positive. They're driving down costs. They're part of innovation, and they feel like they're a real solution to the climate center mission.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for your attention, and have a great lunch.